Oh boy, here we go. Today I'm going to be playing as the Dark Elves in a tournament using their most elite units, which almost never see play. And for a good reason too, because they're rather slow and don't have a lot of HP. So that means they either get shot or magic to death most of the time. But if I play my cards just right, we might be able to avoid this grim fate and actually win a tournament. So let's explain exactly what's going on with this campaign-esque missile dodge that we got at the beginning here. It might seem like we're just falling behind on tickets here, but this is actually a rather sophisticated strategy that works specifically against builds like my opponent's. My opponent has tons of range units, an artillery piece, and skirmishers, while my entire reinforcing and main army consists purely of melee units exclusively. And even though I lose a Manticore for free, which is definitely a misplay, I'm still fairly comfortable in this situation because I know my army can capture all the points if I really want them to. This is because executioners have a load of capture weight, and of course, when you have so much melee, you're naturally going to be pushing your opponent back. And this means, even though technically I'm down trading and behind on tickets, I've realistically already gone 250 tickets for very few losses overall. And even though I'm technically down trading more now that I've moved out of the forest to take the second point, getting twice as many tickets while slowing down my opponents is a pretty good trade. In fact, I do win on 2 capture points here, so as long as I don't run out of units and my opponent is able to recapture these points, I should be in the clear. Now, over the course of a few minutes, my opponent does manage to eventually snipe my lord with his magic, but I already have a load of tickets, and we've both summoned basically every unit in our entire army. But now that my lord is dead, each passing moment is a moment where my army will be catching up with his. So my opponent decides to go for the big push onto the second point, but we have pure melee infantry. And that doesn't really bode well for the Kislevite infantry. By attacking while he's still moving forwards, his formation is in disarray, and at this point I can easily resummon my lord, while my opponent sits on a huge bank of resources that he simply can't spend. It only takes a few moments for me to overrun my opponent's position, and that's because the Dark Elf passive has triggered, which means all of my melee infantry is doing much better in melee now. The game ends looking deceptively close if you look at the tickets, but just based on the number of units on the battlefield, you can see that we weren't really sweating too much. As for the executioners, they didn't get too much value, but most of them didn't see a lot of combat anyways, so I'll forgive them for that. Now in game number 2, my opponent's gone for a rush build, which means we can't exactly do the same strategy as last time. If he captures all 3 points, we're not really getting any advantage outside of building my army up, so we're gonna try and make a big play with these very elite shades. By lying in wait and not putting them on the points, they can remain stealthed until his cavalry get in range, and we can release a very devastating volley on his Chaos Knights. But unfortunately for me, the damage output is not enough to really kill them. Now, these are great weapon shades, so they do have pretty decent stats in armor piercing, and we're going to see if they can kill the cavalry here. Cause you'd think spending a ton of extra money to make your range units hybrid would actually help them fight, and while they do grind for a little bit, dealing a decent amount of damage, they still die cause they don't really have a lot of HP. But I am able to sub them out with my elite infantry, and my opponent is more or less stuck in a melee grind now. And you know what? I gotta say, the Blackguard of Nagorond were amazing in this situation, cause most people are ready for the lightly armored infantry of the Dark Elves, but these highly armored Blackguard of Nagorond, well, they just annihilate his Forsaken. And you can tell my opponent's starting to realize how much of a problem they are, because he starts casting Searing Doom on them, but to very little avail. They're just able to continuously grind away at his army, while my lord slowly chips away at Sartorial on her big dragon. And with full control in the air, all I really gotta do in this game now is bring in my elite Knights of the Ebon Claw for cleanup, and capture these points before we run out of tickets. Now, thankfully for me, Blackguard of Nagaron did get a buff recently, not to their stats, but to their capture weight. So even though they are pretty battered and bruised, they are able to slowly swing the point back in their favor against all odds. And despite having effectively no HP left, they still have over half their leadership, so I can count on them to stay on the point and keep it under my control. Point number 2 falls shortly after as I begin to hunt Sartorial with my Spirit Leeching Lord, and point number 3 is secured shortly after that, with my opponent tapping out since he's effectively army wiped now. And at this point, I'm starting to get pretty impressed with my elite units, because the Blackguard get 1800 gold, and they actually won me the game because my early gameplay, losing all the shades, was pretty blunderous. But it really goes to show that these oft unused units, they can be useful if your opponent is not ready for them. But this match, my opponent is most definitely prepared because he's brought lead belchers against my Blackguard. While they can absolutely win a melee grind against ogres, they don't really do well when they're getting shot to pieces. Now, I do have bolt throwers to kill off his lead belchers, but there's a little bit of a problem. You see, my Crows of Cain just got Fate of Bunad, which means that my 750 gold anti-air is now about to rout from the battlefield, and without them, my artillery's about to get jumped by a bunch of blood vultures. It's even worse with Dark Elf artillery because they don't have a lot of HP, so they go down rather quickly. Then, with no fear of getting shot at, the lead belchers march up and they begin annihilating my poor Blackguard. But all is not lost quite yet. I am able to restabilize the situation a bit by bringing back my artillery crews and remanning the artillery pieces, and this does push back the lead belchers a bit. I'm then able to secure 2 points, which means we're not going to be losing on tickets anytime soon, but with the resummon of lead belchers in the distance, I'm in a little bit of a pickle, because my infantry is not really fast enough to catch them, so I'm going to have to give up the points. Otherwise, we're just going to keep getting shot at. And another rather minor problem that we have here, my War Hydra that I spent over 1,500 gold to field, well, it's about to rout at 75% HP. That's because it does not have a lot of leadership, and this means that I'm about to lose a ton of value. Really goes to show that not all expensive units are made equal. I put it in more or less a perfect position for its unit type, grinding in melee against a bunch of low leadership units, but it still didn't really perform well. And without this very important centerpiece, we lose the game shortly after, with the Mighty Hydra getting a measly 600 gold value at the end of the game, less than a lot of my light cavalry. But this is a Swiss tournament, so even though we've lost one game, as long as I can win this next one, I'm more or less guaranteed to make it to the semifinals, or the tiebreaker for the semifinals. And once again, I've decided to bring Shade Great Swords, the most expensive variant of Shades, just to see if they can handle themselves against dwarves in melee. Now their ranged fire will make short work of these dwarf warriors, but with flame cannons firing back, I gotta choose either to advance forwards or play defensively and just try and damage mitigate. At first, I decide to pull back because he has 2 engineers with slows on them, and I don't really want to risk a fight, but with my opponent line of sighting my bolt throwers, my hand is kind of forced. So here's the strategy. I split my forces to make it a little bit more difficult for my opponent to evenly defend both sides. As long as one flank can make it through, they should be able to push onto his artillery pieces and hopefully shut them down. And thankfully for me, even though my left flank is getting pushed back, my right flank is able to push through with a couple harpies and my shades. This means my left flank can play a lot more defensively, which will help them trade up, and on the right, as long as we can chase off these cannons, I'm pretty happy. My opponent does summon in some slayers to try and save his artillery pieces, but without flame cannon shooting at me now, all sides of my army can begin pushing forwards and pressuring his range units. And it's at this point that my passive procs, which means all my units get way more leadership and melee stats, so we're definitely sitting comfortable now. I've triple capped my opponent, and it's only a matter of time before his army gets knocked off the battlefield. I then bring in some Hargoneth Executioners, and I'm able to send them on to Slayers, which goes very well thanks to my Executioners, because all of my opponent's ranged units are now off the battlefield. In this case, my Shades didn't do super well, but my Elite Cold One Dread Knights definitely made up the difference. Which brings us to the top 8. I gotta win my next 3 matches to win the tournament, and it's gonna be Dark Elves vs Vampire Coast. Now I brought a lot of Sisters of Slaughter and Witch Elves, which will absolutely annihilate his front line. But I do have to shut down most of his ranged, or they're just gonna get bombed or shot to death. So I'm very thankful that I have Harpies to ward off his deck dropper handguns, and Dark Rider crossbows to ward off Silostra. I then accidentally bait out a Vangeist Revenge, which I'm able to dodge by simply walking forwards with my army. It just takes way too long to fire, and this puts me in an amazing position. Because all I really have to do is make sure that I retreat away from the front of his bombers and flank with them using Harpies or my very fast infantry. Even though they have the potential to one-shot my infantry, my units are just much faster, and as long as we're microing correctly, it should be impossible for them to get any volleys off. And this means our final threat is going to be Silostra. I target fire her with my bolt throwers, and soon after, she goes down, which means we will be heading into the semifinals. And what do you know, we're up against the same opponent that we faced earlier, who defeated us with his Ogre Kingdoms build. But this time, our builds are looking a little bit different. I have a Karth, because he has a ton of bonus versus large, and 2 Manticores to make sure I can fight any single entities he brings to the battlefield. My opponent, on the other hand, has brought Golg, and a melee-centric army that doesn't have any lead belchers at the start. Now you may be a little surprised that I decided to bring Witch Elves, an anti-infantry unit, against a large faction, but they are surprisingly useful here, because Ogres, they really rely on Noblars to stop themselves from getting flanked. But with the Witch Elves clearing them off so quickly, my cavalry have more or less free reign on the Ogre Bulls. I'm able to get a couple terror routes very early on, and shortly after, the entire Ogre front line is starting to buckle. Then with so many Noblars dying, our Dark Elf passive triggers, and now we're just up trading across the board. So next time you find yourself struggling against the Ogre Kingdoms, maybe cut your spears and consider taking a huge amount of anti-infantry. And for any of you wondering if lead belchers would have changed the situation, remember we basically ran a full rush build into an ogre melee build and came out on top. So generally speaking, I think we would have been fine. So all we gotta do now is finish off the grand finals against one of our own viewers. He's playing a pretty conventional build with a few skirmishers, some infantry, and a healthy amount of archers. I did expect the skirmishers though, and my Shades make short work of them with a little bit of an ambush. And as for my build, it's going to be a pretty nice leadership bombing strat. The idea is simple. I got a -6 leadership aura on Lokir Felheart, a -8 leadership debuff for anything hit by Burning Head, terror, fear, and anything that's fighting Witch Elves will be taking so much damage that they'll be routing soon after. And on top of having 2 Manticores which can spread terror, along with a regiment of renowned Witch Elves who also provide terror, I might be able to get a mass rout on his entire army. So feeling confident, I rush into battle, knowing that he'll probably be shooting Lokir, but that his damage won't actually be high enough to kill him before we completely overrun his army. A Burning Head does a lot of damage to his front line, and so far things are looking pretty good. With so many leadership reducing effects, his front line is already beginning to waver, and there's not that many more lines of infantry before we get onto his archers. And realistically, they've only done a quarter damage to Lokir so far, so he's far from going down. And because Lokir's been drawing so much fire, my Witch Elves are still in very good health, and they are amazing for pushing the advantage. Another Burning Head clears out his right flank, cavalry go into the back to hit his cavalry, and this is a very one-sided victory. And remember, we did have executioners mixed in, so if he did decide to bring in any strong melee fighters like Black Orcs, they would have gone chopped to pieces too. So there you have it, an Elite Dark Elf tournament win which showcases more or less all of their expensive units. I'd say my least favorite of the bunch is probably the War Hydra, with the Witch Elves and Sisters of Slaughter doing quite well. Executioners were only okay, and as usual, Cold One Dread Knights were really good. I'm not gonna say Elite Infantry are meta though, because if they ever catch on, people are just gonna bring anti-infantry spells. But at least for now, I hope you enjoyed, and if you want to see more content like this, I highly recommend checking out the video in the bottom right.